Imagine a packed auditorium,
Mhm.
right? The air is thick with anticipation.
Mhm.
Spotlights hit two figures on stage, and then this question just cuts through the silence. If the universe had a beginning, what caused it?
Yeah.
Now, for one of those figures, William Lane Craig, this isn't just some abstract philosophical puzzle. For him, it leads directly to God.
Right. That's the intellectual battleground where he's really made his name, hasn't he? Taking on some really prominent thinkers.
Exactly. And maybe you're listening as a student of philosophy, grappling with these big, complex ideas. Or maybe you're just really curious about the fundamental questions of existence.
Uh-huh.
Well, today we're doing a deep dive into the mind and, frankly, the powerful arguments of one of the most significant Christian philosophers working today.
That's right. And our mission here is really to unpack the sources that shed light on Craig's, well, remarkable journey. We want to look at his most prominent arguments for God's existence.
The big ones.
Yeah, the big ones. And we'll break them down step by step, try to make them really accessible. We'll also explore his very distinctive, you could say formidable, approach to public debate and intellectual discussion.
All right.
The goal is to quickly but thoroughly inform you about how Craig goes about constructing this, well, robust, intellectually rigorous case for Christian belief. Think of it as a shortcut, maybe, to understanding this ongoing intellectual struggle between, theistic and atheistic worldviews.
Right. So you'll get not just what he argues.
Exactly. But how he builds the case, how he tackles objections, and really why his work keeps shaping the conversation around faith and reason in such a profound way. It's quite influential.
Okay, sounds good. Let's dive in. Where do we start? Maybe with the man himself, William Lane Craig's path to apologetics, and maybe first, what does he even mean by apologetics?
Good place to start. His academic background is, well, it's genuinely formidable. It really lays a unique foundation. He got his BA in communications from Wheaton College.
Which is interesting in itself, right? Communication skills.
Definitely helps. But then he really went deep into academia. He got not one, but 2 doctorates. A PhD in philosophy from the University of Birmingham in England,
Okay.
and a Doctor of Theology from the University of Munich in Germany.
Wow, okay. Philosophy and theology at the doctoral level.
And it's that dual expertise that really positions him uniquely. He's not just a theologian sort of dabbling in philosophy or vice versa. He can genuinely speak with authority across both fields.
Bridging that gap.
Right, bridging what people often see as separate, sometimes even conflicting disciplines.
Right.
And you see this academic grounding in his writing, too. He's incredibly prolific, authored and edited more than 30 books.
30.
Yeah, including some really foundational texts like the Kalam Cosmological Argument, Reasonable Faith, Time and Eternity. It's not just the quantity, it's the depth. He engages with incredibly complex ideas in both areas. It shows a real lifelong commitment to rigorous scholarship.
It's not just theory, is it? He's actively interested in teaching.
That's right. He's currently a research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology out in California. And that role really highlights his dedication to training future thinkers, shaping the next generation of Christian apologists and philosophers.
So it's clear his mission goes beyond just making arguments himself. He wants to equip others, too.
Definitely. Cultivating a new generation of intellectual defenders of the faith, you could say.
Okay, so with that background, how does he define this term, Christian apologetics? What does it mean to him?
Right. For him, it's much more than just, reacting defensively. He explains the word apologetics comes from the Greek apologia, which means a defense.
Like in court.
Exactly like a lawyer presenting a well-reasoned defense.
Yeah.
It's not about apologizing for your faith. For Craig, it's the branch of Christian theology that aims to provide a rational justification for the truth claims of the Christian faith.
So building a positive case.
Precisely. Building a positive intellectual case for Christianity, not just batting away attacks against it.
That distinction feels really important.
It is. He sees apologetics primarily as a theoretical discipline. It's aimed first at, expressing love for God with the mind, a deep intellectual pursuit in its own right.
But with practical applications.
Oh, absolutely. Crucial practical applications. It's not just an ivory tower thing. For him, it serves multiple purposes. Showing unbelievers that Christianity is true, or at least reasonable.
Okay.
Confirming faith for believers who might be wrestling with doubts. And also exploring those fascinating connections between Christian doctrine and other truths from philosophy, science, history. It's quite holistic.
And he talks about offensive versus defensive apologetics.
Yes, he emphasizes what he calls offensive apologetics. He thinks that rather than just refuting objections all the time, the most effective strategy is to focus on building a strong, positive case for Christianity.
Why is that more effective in his view?
His reasoning is pretty strategic. He basically argues that if your positive case is strong and compelling enough, it automatically overwhelms all competing worldviews that just don't have that same intellectual firepower.
Hmm, interesting. So if you show Christianity is likely true, the other options just fall away by comparison.
That's the idea. If your positive apologetic holds up, you've essentially done the main job. Counter arguments become less damaging.
That is a powerful way to frame it. It shifts the dynamic.
Yeah,
And this connects to his idea of giving intellectual permission to believe.
exactly. Craig is very clear here. He doesn't think arguments and evidence necessarily cause someone to believe. He sees that as ultimately the work of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
But what apologetics can do, he argues, is make the gospel a credible option for thinking people.
Which is vital today, wouldn't you say,
Yeah.
in our secular age?
Absolutely vital. Many people just assume faith is irrational, a blind leap. Apologetics helps clear away those intellectual roadblocks, making it intellectually respectable to even consider Christian belief, let alone embrace it.
Okay, so that sets the stage for his mission. What about his engagement with contemporary culture and philosophy?
Right. He makes this interesting observation that Christian philosophy, far from being dead or irrelevant, is actually experiencing what he calls a veritable renaissance.
A renaissance, really?
Yeah. He sees this resurgence as having really reinvigorated natural theology, the whole project of trying to understand God through reason and observing the natural world.
So Christian thought has more of a voice now.
That's his point. He argues it now has a respected minority status and, crucially, a place at the table in contemporary philosophical discussions, which is a pretty big shift from, say, the mid-20th century when atheistic or purely scientific views often dominated academic philosophy.
Okay, and this ties into his view on postmodernism.
Mm-hmm.
He has a strong take on that, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah. He provocatively calls the idea that we live in a truly postmodern culture a myth.
Well, myth. Why?
Because, he argues, a genuinely postmodern culture would be utterly unlivable. Think about it, he says. People aren't relativistic about science or engineering or medicine.
You don't read a medicine label and say, well, that dosage is your truth, man, not mine.
Exactly. He points out that people only tend to become relativistic when it comes to religion and ethics. And he sees that not as genuine postmodernism, but actually as a hangover from old-line modernism, specifically things like positivism and verificationism.
Explain those quickly.
Sure. Positivism basically was the idea that if you can't prove something with your five senses or verify it scientifically, it's just opinion or personal taste, not objective truth. So Craig thinks this selective relativism is just that old way of thinking, repackaged.
Okay, and this belief that people do still accept objective truth in other areas, that underpins his confidence in rational argument.
Precisely. It's why he believes rational arguments are still effective and necessary, because people do operate with a belief in objective truth in most areas of their lives.
Now, here's something I find fascinating. His view that Christianity's truth is tied to historical facts.
Yes, this is a really key point for him. He believes Christianity is unique because its truth is inseparably attached to facts whose truth cannot be sincerely contested.
Yeah.
Meaning, the truth or falsity of Christianity stands or falls with individual events within history. It's not just about abstract ideas or feelings.
So it's testable in a way.
That's exactly his argument. It offers a concrete, empirical means of potentially verifying its truth through historical evidence, setting it apart from many other religious systems. If certain historical events didn't happen, then for Craig, Christianity is simply false.
Okay, that's a really strong foundation. So with that context set, let's get into the core arguments. Where should we start? The Kalam.
Yes, the Kalam Cosmological Argument, or KCA, it's probably his most famous argument, and it really gets to the heart of the universe's origin.
And it's not actually his invention, is it? It has older roots.
That's right, deep historical roots, actually. It originates with medieval Islamic theologians, figures like Al-Ghazali back in the 11th century.
Wow, okay. What were they using it for?
They used it primarily to argue against Aristotle's idea of an eternal, uncreated universe. So it's an old argument, but Craig has definitely revitalized it, strengthened it with modern scientific evidence, and brought it right back into the center of contemporary philosophical debates.
So what's the basic structure? You mentioned Al-Ghazali's formulation.
Yeah, it's a very elegant, simple syllogism. Just two premises leading to a conclusion. Al-Ghazali put it like this. Every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. Now the world is a being which begins. Therefore, it possesses a cause for its beginning.
Simple enough. Let's break down those premises. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Why should we accept that?
Craig, often working with philosopher James Sinclair, argues this premise is, well, obviously true, or at the very least more plausibly true than its negation. He gives basically three main lines of support.
Okay, what's the first?
First is just rational intuition, that fundamental metaphysical sense that something cannot come into being from nothing. Ex nihilo nihil fit, as the Latin has it. Things don't just pop into existence uncaused. It feels deeply intuitive.
Okay, intuition. What else?
Second, he uses a classic logical technique called reductio ad absurdum.
Reduction to absurdity.
Exactly. You assume the opposite is true for a moment and show it leads to nonsense. So, if premise 1 were false, if things could begin to exist without a cause, Craig asks, why doesn't anything and everything just randomly pop into existence all the time?
Right, like bicycles or, as he says, hot dogs just appearing out of thin air.
Yeah, or elephants. It would be utterly inexplicable and frankly absurd if the causal principle didn't hold true for things that begin to exist.
Makes sense. And the third reason?
The third is just inductive reasoning from our experience. Everything we observe constantly, consistently verifies this principle. Science is built on finding causes for effects. We just don't see things beginning without a cause in the real world.
So intuition, avoiding absurdity, and universal experience. Seems strong. But have people challenged this premise?
Oh, absolutely. Philosophers like David Hume back in the 18th century, and more recently J.L. Mackie. Hume argued we never actually observe causation itself, just one event following another. So he thought maybe the idea of cause doesn't apply before the universe since our idea comes from the universe.
Okay. And Mackie?
Mackie essentially argued you can't necessarily extrapolate the causal principle from experiences within the universe to the universe itself as a whole. Maybe the whole thing is an exception.
How does Craig respond to that? To the idea that maybe an uncaused beginning is conceivable?
He points out, citing other philosophers like Reichenbach and Anscombe, that there are real problems in inferring factual possibility from conceivability.
Reading thing.
Just because you can imagine something, like maybe something popping into existence without a cause, doesn't mean it's actually possible in reality. You can imagine a square circle, maybe, but it's not actually possible. So conceivability doesn't equal real possibility.
Okay, fair point. Let's move to premise 2 then. The universe began to exist. This feels like a bigger claim. How does he support this one?
Right. He supports this with two main lines of argument: philosophical arguments and scientific arguments.
Let's take the philosophical ones first.
Okay. These center on the idea that an actual infinite cannot exist in reality. Now, this needs a careful distinction.
Between potential and actual infinite.
Exactly. A potential infinite is something that can always increase or be divided further, but it's never completed. Like counting numbers, you can always count higher, but you never reach an actual infinity. Or dividing a line segment, you can always divide it smaller, potentially infinitely, but you never reach a final indivisible point.
Right. So what's an actual infinite?
An actual infinite would be a completed, fully realized infinite set, like an infinite number of books already existing on a shelf, or an infinite number of past events having actually already occurred. Craig argues that an actually infinite number of things cannot exist in reality.
Why not? What's the problem with it?
He argues it leads to demonstrable absurdities. For instance, you can't form an actual infinite by successive addition. Think about trying to count down all the negative numbers, ending at 0.
You'd never get there.
You'd never finish. Because you're always adding one more past event, you never arrive at the present moment having traversed an actual infinite.
Okay, that makes sense. Any other examples?
Al-Ghazali, the original Kalam proponent, used a great illustration. Imagine two planets, say Saturn and Jupiter, orbiting a star from eternity past. Let's say Jupiter orbits 2.5 times for every one orbit of Saturn.
Okay.
If they've been orbiting for an actually infinite amount of time, which one has completed more orbits?
Yeah, Jupiter, obviously. It orbits faster.
Right, intuitively.
Uh.
But mathematically, if they've both completed an infinite number of orbits, they've completed the same infinite number, which seems absurd given the constant difference in their rates.
Huh. Yeah, that is weird.
And other paradoxes arise, like, would the total number of orbits completed be an even number or an odd number? The question doesn't even make sense for a completed infinite. These paradoxes show the problems with trying to instantiate an actual infinite in the real world.
But what about modern mathematics? Didn't George Cantor's work on set theory kind of legitimize the actual infinite? People often bring that up.
They do, and Craig addresses it directly. He acknowledges that Cantor's work showed the actual infinite is mathematically consistent and incredibly useful within the abstract realm of mathematics. But he argues mathematical consistency doesn't automatically mean metaphysical possibility in the real world. Many mathematicians themselves, even famous ones like David Hilbert, were anti-realists about the infinite. Hilbert famously said, "The infinite is nowhere to be found in reality." They saw it as a useful idea, a universe of discourse, but not something that actually describes physical reality.
Okay, so the philosophical argument rests on these paradoxes of an actual infinite past. What about the scientific arguments for the universe beginning?
Right. This is where Craig brings in modern cosmology, and the evidence here has become incredibly strong over the last century. The biggest piece is the expanding universe.
The Big Bang.
Essentially, yes. We used to think the universe was static and eternal. That was the standard view for centuries. But then came Einstein's general theory of relativity.
Which predicted expansion.
Initially, it predicted either expansion or contraction. Einstein actually disliked that implication so much he added a cosmological constant. He called it his biggest blunder later to try and force a static universe in his equations.
But others ran with the expansion idea.
Yes, physicists like Alexander Friedmann and Georges Lemaitre developed solutions to Einstein's equations that predicted an expanding universe. And then, crucially, Edwin Hubble provided the observational evidence in the 1920s showing that galaxies are indeed moving away from us.
And if you run the expansion backwards,
Exactly. If you trace the expansion backward in time, using the equations of general relativity, everything converges to an initial cosmological singularity, a point of infinite density, infinite temperature, infinite curvature.
where space and time themselves began.
That's the implication of the standard model. Before that singularity, literally nothing existed, not even empty space or time. It represents an absolute beginning out of non-being, creation ex nihilo.
Wow. That's a powerful scientific conclusion. Have scientists tried to find ways around this absolute beginning?
Oh, constantly. There's often a philosophical resistance to the idea of a beginning because of its potential theological implications. So various models have been proposed.
Like what?
Well, there were oscillating models, the idea that the universe expands, then collapses back in a big crunch, and then bounces into a new Big Bang, potentially repeating forever.
Did those hold up?
They ran into serious problems, particularly with the Penrose-Hawking singularity theorems developed around 1970. These theorems showed, mathematically, that under very general conditions, even a collapsing universe would inevitably hit a singularity. It couldn't just bounce forever. It hit a wall, not a trampoline.
Okay, so oscillating models are largely out. What else? Quantum gravity. String theory.
Right. People look to quantum gravity models, like some versions of string theory or loop quantum gravity, hoping they might smooth out that initial singularity.
And do they eliminate the beginning?
Craig argues that even these models, while perhaps describing the beginning differently, maybe not a single point, still generally imply a finite past for the universe. Cosmologist Alexander Vilenkin, who works on these models, is quite famous for concluding that, based on the theorems he and others developed, all the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. Even quantum beginnings seem to be beginnings nonetheless.
What about multiverse ideas? Maybe our universe is just one bubble in a larger eternal multiverse.
That's another avenue explored. But even these face challenges. One major one is the Boltzmann brain problem.
Ah, right. Explain that again briefly.
The idea is, if our universe is just a random fluctuation in some vast, eternal sea of energy or a multiverse, statistically, it's overwhelmingly more probable that a much smaller fluctuation would occur first.
Like just a single brain with false memories.
And exactly. A single momentarily conscious Boltzmann brain is vastly more probable than an entire, complex, ordered universe like ours appearing and lasting for billions of years. The fact that we aren't just Boltzmann brains, that we observe this large, stable, ordered universe, makes these eternal fluctuation models highly problematic as explanations for what we actually see. Roger Penrose's calculation of the odds against our universe's low entropy start 1 in 10 to the power of 10 to the 123 really drives this home.
That number is just mind-boggling.
It really is.
Now, a common objection you hear is God of the gaps. People like Lawrence Krauss accuse Craig of just sticking God in wherever science currently has a question mark. How does Craig respond to that?
He's very clear on this, and it's a crucial distinction. He insists he is not using science to prove God. He's using scientific evidence like the Big Bang evidence to support a premise in his philosophical argument, namely, that the universe began to exist.
So the science establishes the beginning.
Right, which he argues is a religiously neutral scientific finding. Then the philosophical argument takes over, the claim that God's existence is more probable given the beginning of the universe than it would have been without it is a philosophical inference from the scientific data, not a scientific conclusion itself. He's not filling a gap in science, he's drawing a philosophical conclusion from science.
Okay, that's an important clarification. So if both premises of the Kalam argument are true, whatever begins has a cause, and the universe began, the conclusion follows,
Cool.
the universe has a cause. What does this argument tell us about the nature of that cause?
Quite a lot, actually. Based on the logic of the argument, this first cause must have several specific properties. Since it created space and time, it must itself be outside of space and time.
So timeless, spaceless.
It's timeless, spaceless, and therefore immaterial, non-physical. Because it created all matter and energy, it must be enormously powerful.
Makes sense.
And critically, it must be uncaused itself. Otherwise, you just push the problem back and get an infinite regress of causes, which the philosophical arguments against actual infinites were designed to rule out.
Okay, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, powerful. Anything else?
Yes, and this is maybe the most striking inference. Craig argues the cause must be a personal free agent.
Personal? Why? How do you get personality out of cosmology?
The reasoning goes like this. If the cause is timeless and changeless, how could it give rise to a temporal effect like the universe beginning at a specific point? If the cause were just an impersonal, mechanically operating set of conditions, then its effect, the universe should exist eternally along with the cause.
Ah, I see. If the conditions were sufficient, the universe should have always been there.
Exactly. The only way to get a temporal effect from an eternal, changeless cause, Craig argues, is if the cause is an agent with free will who can choose to create the effect in time. It requires a volitional act.
A conscious choice.
A conscious choice. He also applies Occam's razor, the principle of not multiplying entities beyond necessity, to argue for the unicity or oneness of this first cause. The simplest explanation is a single ultimate cause.
So putting it all together, an uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe.
That's the profile the Kalam argument delivers. And as Craig points out, it is no secret that one of the most important conceptions of what theists mean by God is creator of heaven and earth. The properties align remarkably well with the traditional concept of God.
It's a really powerful argument, tracing logic from a simple premise about beginnings all the way to a description of a transcendent creator.
It is, and it's just one of the pillars of his case. Shall we move on to the fine-tuning argument?
Yes, let's. The teleological argument, right? Based on the universe's design or purpose.
Sort of, but Craig is careful with the word design initially. He focuses on fine-tuning. He defines this not as assuming design, but simply as a neutral expression, acknowledging that the fundamental constants and quantities of physics are balanced on a razor's edge for life to exist.
Just right, for life.
Exactly. The values for things like gravity, the electromagnetic force, the strong and weak nuclear forces, the mass of elementary particles, they fall within an extraordinarily narrow range that permits complex chemistry, stars that burn long enough, planets that can form, and ultimately intelligent life. If they were even slightly different, the universe would be radically different and utterly hostile to life as we know it.
And you mentioned Roger Penrose's calculation earlier about the initial entropy, the odds being astronomically small.
Yes, that's one powerful example. Penrose calculated the odds of our universe's specific low-entropy initial condition occurring by chance as 1 in 10 to the power of 10 to the 123. It's a number so precise and vast it's hard to even write down, let alone comprehend. That level of precision screams out for an explanation.
So what's the core argument Craig builds on this fine-tuning?
The argument basically says this fine-tuning is due to one of three things: physical necessity, chance, or design. He then argues against the first two, leaving design as the best explanation.
Okay, why isn't it physical necessity? Couldn't the constants have to have the values they do?
He argues there's no evidence for that. As far as physics knows, these constants are independent parameters. The laws of physics seem to work perfectly well mathematically. Even if you plug in different values for these constants, they don't seem to be required by the laws themselves.
So they appear contingent, not necessary. What about chance? That seems like the most common alternative explanation.
It is. And the main way people try to make chance plausible is by invoking the multiverse, or the many worlds hypothesis.
The idea being, if there are trillions upon trillions of universes, eventually one will get lucky and have the right numbers for life, right?
Yeah.
And we just happen to be in that one.
That's the idea. It tries to overcome the staggering improbability within our single universe by multiplying the number of chances across a vast cosmic landscape.
How does Craig respond to the multiverse idea?
He raises several challenges. First, he questions whether we have good independent evidence for a multiverse-generating mechanism. While some theories like eternal inflation predict a multiverse, they are still speculative.
Okay.
But more fundamentally, he argues that even if a multiverse exists, it doesn't escape the fine-tuning problem, and it runs headlong into the Boltzmann brain problem again.
How so?
Because even in a multiverse, if universes are being generated randomly, it's still vastly more probable that you'd observe a small, minimal patch of order like a Boltzmann brain than a huge, complex, finely tuned universe like ours. The multiverse doesn't actually make our specific kind of universe more probable. It arguably makes it less probable compared to simpler fluctuations.
So the multiverse doesn't really solve the improbability issue for our observations.
That's Craig's contention. It might explain why a life-permitting universe exists somewhere, but it struggles to explain why we find ourselves in this specific, highly ordered one, rather than a much more probable, minimal fluctuation.
So if it's not necessity, and chance, even with a multiverse, is problematic, that leaves.
Design. Craig argues that design is therefore the most plausible explanation for the observed fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life.
Now the pushback here, often from people like Richard Dawkins, is that invoking God as the designer just replaces one complex thing, the universe, with an even more complex thing, God. So it doesn't actually simplify the explanation.
Right, the who designed the designer
Yeah.
objection. Craig has a very specific and I think clever response to this. He argues Dawkins makes a category error. He confused a mind's ideas, which may indeed be complex, with a mind itself, which is an incredibly simple entity.
What does that mean? How is a mind simple?
Ontologically simple. A mind, conceived as an unextended, immaterial consciousness, doesn't have the complex parts and physical structure that the universe does. Think of it like a computer program versus the programmer. The program might be incredibly complex, but the mind of the programmer is, in a fundamental sense, a single, unified consciousness.
So postulating a divine mind isn't adding more complexity, it's proposing a simpler type of entity as the explanation.
Exactly. Craig argues that postulating a divine mind behind the universe most definitely does represent an advance in simplicity, compared to saying the universe's complex, fine-tuned order arose from sheer chance or unexplained necessity. So out of the three options, necessity, chance, or design, he concludes, design is the most plausible inference.
Okay, we've covered the cosmos, its beginning, and its fine-tuning. Let's shift focus now to morality. This is another major area for Craig, isn't it? The moral argument.
Absolutely. It's one of his most powerful and honestly often debated arguments. It really hits close to home because it deals with something we all experience directly, moral values and duties.
What's the core claim?
It's quite stark and provocative. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist.
Okay, objective is the key word there, isn't it?
Yeah.
You need to be crystal clear on what he means by that.
Absolutely critical. When Craig says objective, he means something is good or evil, independently of whether any human being believes it to be so.
Like his example of the Holocaust.
Exactly. The Holocaust was objectively wrong. It was wrong even though the Nazis carrying it out thought it was right. And it would still be wrong even if they had somehow won and brainwashed everyone into agreeing with them. Its wrongness isn't dependent on human opinion or consensus.
And the same applies to moral duties.
Yes. Objective moral duties mean certain actions are genuinely right or wrong for us, regardless of what we think or feel. We have an objective duty not to torture innocent children for fun, for instance. That's not just a matter of taste or cultural preference, it's objectively wrong.
And Craig argues that without God, this kind of objective morality disappears.
Yes. He argues that without God as a transcendent anchor point, we're simply lost in sociocultural relativism. He pushes the point. If there's no objective standard, who are you to judge that the Nazi ethic was wrong, or the ethics of slave owners, or any other culturally accepted practice we now find abhorrent?
So without God, it all just becomes opinion or evolution.
That's his point. It becomes a matter of sociobiological evolution and cultural conditioning. There's no ultimate ground for saying one culture's values are truly better or worse than another's, only different. He even quotes Richard Dawkins' rather bleak assessment of a godless universe.
What was that?
Dawkins wrote that in an atheistic view, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. Craig argues that while that might sound depressing, it's the logically consistent conclusion if atheism is true. No God, no objective good or evil.
Okay, but this is where objections immediately come in, right? People say, but atheists can be good people. I know lots of moral atheists.
Right. And Craig is very quick to point out that this completely misses the point of his argument. He calls these strawman objections.
So what is the point? He needs to distinguish between knowing right and wrong and whether right and wrong actually exist objectively.
Precisely. It's the distinction between moral epistemology, how we know about morality, and moral ontology,
Yeah.
the reality or grounding of morality.
Okay, unpack that.
His argument is not that you have to believe in God to know what's right or wrong or to behave morally. He fully accepts that atheists can know morality and live good lives.
So what is the argument then?
He states it very clearly. The argument is not that belief in God's existence is necessary for the objective reality of moral values and duties, but that God himself is necessary for the objective reality of moral values and duties.
Ah, okay, so God doesn't have to be believed in for morality to be known, but he has to exist for morality to be objectively real.
Exactly. The atheist and the theist might largely agree on what is right and wrong, epistemology, but they disagree fundamentally on why it's objectively right or wrong, or whether it truly is objective at all, ontology.
So how do we know right from wrong, according to Craig, if it's not just belief in God?
He suggests we know moral truths through things like moral intuition and reflection. He even points to the Bible in Romans chapter 2, which says God's moral law is written on the hearts of all men, believer and unbeliever alike.
So our conscience, our basic moral sense, gives us access to this objective moral reality, which he argues is grounded in God.
That's the idea. Our moral epistemology, how we know, can be largely shared, even if our moral ontology, the foundation, differs radically.
Okay, now what about his claim that atheistic morality is somehow inconsistent?
Right. He argues that if atheism is true, then life is ultimately objectively meaningless because there's no ultimate purpose or value given from outside the system.
Pointless indifference, like Dawkins said.
Yes. But, Craig observes, humans seem psychologically incapable of living consistently and happily knowing that life is meaningless. So what do? They pretend that life has meaning. They adopt values, live for goals, act as if things matter objectively, even though their worldview says, at bottom, nothing truly does.
So it's an inconsistency between the worldview and how people actually live.
That's his charge. He points to figures like Albert Camus or Bertrand Russell, atheistic humanists who strongly affirmed values like love, compassion, and human dignity, while simultaneously denying any objective foundation for those very values.
Did Russell acknowledge this tension?
He did. Russell famously admitted he couldn't live as if moral values were just subjective taste. He found his own philosophical conclusions about morality incredible when he tried to apply them consistently in his life. He felt the pull of objective values even while denying their basis.
And Craig connects this to Dostoevsky's famous line.
Yes, if God does not exist, all things are permitted. Craig takes this to mean that without God, there's ultimately no objective basis for saying anything is truly right or wrong. It's a metaphysical Auschwitz where any action is permissible because there's no ultimate moral law.
But nobody actually lives like that.
Exactly his point. No atheist, he argues, can live consistently with such a view of life. They inevitably live as if certain things are objectively wrong, as if values matter.
He uses the example of self-sacrifice, right?
Yes, the poignant example of a man sacrificing his life to save others in a fire. For the theist, this is unambiguously noble and good. But for the consistent atheist, Craig argues, it's arguably the stupidest thing possible. Why throw away your own finite existence for others if there's no objective value? Self-preservation should logically prevail.
Yet everyone, including atheists, praises such acts.
Right. Craig says atheists, like the rest of us, instinctively reacts with praise for this man's selfless action. This deep-seated, almost universal moral intuition, he suggests, points beyond a purely naturalistic worldview. It reveals an inherent inconsistency in living out atheism.
So, if objective morals do exist, how does Craig ground them in God? What's the connection?
He argues that God, by definition as the greatest conceivable being, must be the ultimate standard of goodness. It's part of what it means to be maximally great. A being who is the paradigm of goodness is greater than one who merely conforms to an external standard of goodness.
So God's nature is the good.
Yes. He says, unless we are nihilists, we have to recognize some ultimate standard of value, and God is the least arbitrary stopping point. God's own holy and loving nature provides the absolute objective standard for moral values.
How does this solve the Euthyphro dilemma? Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good?
Craig argues it dissolves the dilemma. It's not that God's commands make something good arbitrarily, which is the first horn, nor is it that God is conforming to some standard of goodness external to himself, the second horn.
So what's the alternative?
The alternative is that God commands what he commands because he is good. His commands flow necessarily from his unchanging, perfectly good nature. They are necessary reflections of his nature, not arbitrary whims. So goodness isn't independent of God, nor is it arbitrarily defined by God. It's grounded in God's essential character.
Okay, that makes sense. It grounds morality directly in God's being.
Yeah.
Powerful stuff. Let's shift now to the historical case, specifically the resurrection.
Right. This ties back to that earlier point about Christianity being uniquely rooted in historical events. Craig quotes the theologian George Eldon Ladd. The uniqueness and the scandal of the Christian religion rests in the mediation of revelation through historical events.
So history really matters for Christianity, maybe more than for other faiths.
Immensely so, in Craig's view. Its truth is bound up with the truth of certain historical facts. If those facts didn't happen, particularly the resurrection of Jesus, then Christianity, for Craig, collapses. But the flip side is that this provides a way to investigate its truth claims using historical evidence.
And when it comes to the resurrection, Craig makes a pretty bold claim about historical scholarship, doesn't he?
He makes a striking claim, yes. He asserts that the central facts undergirding the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are actually acknowledged by the wide majority of New Testament critics today.
Including non-Christian scholars.
Yes, be they Christian or non-Christian, liberal or conservative. He argues there's a broad consensus among critical historians, regardless of their personal beliefs, on three key facts.
Okay, what are these three facts?
Fact 1. The tomb of Jesus was found empty on the first day of the week after his crucifixion by a group of his female followers.
What's the evidence for the empty tomb?
He points to several things. Multiple independent sources in the Gospels, Mark, John, Luke's independent source, and the early sermons in Acts. The extremely early dating of these traditions, placing them very close to the events themselves, and perhaps most interestingly, the nature of the earliest Jewish counter-explanation.
Which was what?
The earliest Jewish polemic against the resurrection claimed the disciples stole the body. Craig argues this implicitly concedes the crucial point. The tomb was empty. Otherwise, the authorities could have just produced the body and ended Christianity right there. So even the opposition confirms the tomb was empty. He thinks it's extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds.
Okay, fact 1. Empty tomb. What's fact 2?
Fact 2. Thereafter, different individuals and groups of people came to experience appearances of Jesus alive after his death following his crucifixion.
The post-mortem appearances. What's the evidence here?
Craig heavily relies on the very early creedal formula Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15, which scholars date incredibly early, possibly within just a few years of the crucifixion.
What does that formula list?
It lists specific appearances to Cephas, Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500 brothers at once. Paul notes most were still alive when he wrote, basically inviting verification. Then to James, and finally to all the apostles.
The appearance to James is significant, right? Jesus' brother.
Hugely significant. James was initially a skeptic, not believing during Jesus' earthly ministry, but something transformed him into a pillar of the Jerusalem church, willing to die for his belief in the resurrected Christ. Even skeptical critics like Hans Grass admit the conversion of James is powerful evidence pointing towards the resurrection.
And these weren't just visions. Craig emphasizes the physical nature.
Yes, he points to gospel accounts like Luke 24 and John 20, where Jesus explicitly invites the disciples to touch his wounds and where he eats food with them. This demonstrates, Craig argues, both corporeality and continuity. It wasn't a ghost, but the physically raised, transformed Jesus.
Okay, empty tomb, post-mortem appearances. What's the third fact?
Fact 3. The original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead despite every predisposition to the contrary.
Despite every predisposition. What does he mean by that?
He emphasizes that first-century Jewish beliefs had no category for a Messiah who would be shamefully executed by Gentiles and then rise again individually before the general resurrection at the end of time. A defeated, crucified Messiah was basically a contradiction in terms. Their subsequent belief was profoundly un-Jewish and went against everything they would have expected or naturally conceived.
So something extraordinary must have happened to overcome that deep-seated resistance and convince them.
That's the argument. The origin of Christianity itself, exploding out of this small group of defeated, terrified followers, transforming them into bold witnesses willing to suffer and die for this specific belief, is, for Craig, inexplicable unless Jesus really rose from the dead. The transformation itself requires a powerful explanation.
Okay, those are the three core facts. But what about objections? People object to miracles on principle, don't they? Saying they're unhistorical.
Yes, that's a common objection, often associated with scholars like Ernst Troeltsch or, more recently, Bart Ehrman. It often stems from Troeltsch's principle of analogy.
Which says?
Basically, that we should interpret the past based on our present known experience. Since we don't see people rising from the dead today, we should assume it didn't happen in the past either. It restricts history to purely natural, repeatable events.
How does Craig counter that?
He argues, following theologian Wolfhart Pannenberg, that this principle of analogy cannot be legitimately employed to banish all non-analogous events from history. If an event is truly unique, unprecedented, you can't automatically rule it out just because it has no analogy, especially if alternative explanations, like delusion or conspiracy, fail to adequately account for the evidence.
And he makes that distinction again between evidence and explanation.
Exactly. He stresses that the evidence for the resurrection, the empty tomb, the appearances, the disciples' transformation, is not itself miraculous. It's historical data that needs explaining. The explanation he proposes, God raised Jesus from the dead, is miraculous. It's an inference to the miracle based on the historical facts.
What about other skeptical explanations? Like Jesus didn't really die, or the disciples stole the body, or they went to the wrong tomb.
Craig argues there's a strong consensus of scholarship that these alternative hypotheses are historically implausible and fail to explain all three key facts adequately.
For example?
Well, take the apparent death hypothesis that Jesus just swooned. Craig argues a barely conscious, severely wounded man staggering out of a tomb wouldn't inspire worship as the risen Lord and conqueror of death. It wouldn't launch a global movement. These naturalistic explanations, he contends, just don't have the explanatory power needed for the data we have.
So his conclusion is that the resurrection is the best explanation.
Yes. He concludes the hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, furnishes the best explanation of the historical data relevant to Jesus' final fate. It's not about absolute mathematical proof, but about historical inference, what is more likely than not to have occurred, given the evidence.
Okay. Now, briefly, what about his approach to interpreting other parts of the Bible, especially controversial bits like early Genesis?
Right. He holds a nuanced view here. He argues that Genesis 1:11, particularly chapters 1 to 3, shouldn't be read as straightforward historical narrative in the modern sense. He calls the genre mytho-history.
Mytho-history, what does that mean?
He sees it as a genre similar in form to ancient Near Eastern myths, using symbolic and sometimes metaphorical language, but intended to convey actual historical and theological truths about origins. It's not literal history like a modern biography, but it's not mere fiction either.
So Genesis 1, the 6 days of creation.
He sees that as using the metaphorical language of days primarily to desacralize nature. Unlike pagan myths where the sun, moon, and sea were gods, Genesis portrays them as mere creations of the one transcendent God. This, Craig argues, demystified nature, making it susceptible to human exploration and discovery, essentially providing a conceptual basis for science.
Adam and Eve in Genesis 2 and 3.
He reads that story within this primeval history context. He acknowledges elements like cherubim are likely symbolic or imaginary creatures, given Israel's prohibition against images.
But does he believe Adam and Eve were real historical people?
Yes. Despite the genre, he insists on the historicity of this primordial couple who are at the headwaters of the human race and through whom sin came into the world. This is theologically crucial for him.
How does he square that with science?
He actually proposes identifying Adam and Eve biologically with the species Homo heidelbergensis, an archaic human species living around 750,000 years ago, whose brain size was comparable to ours. He argues this is potentially fully consistent with the evidence of population genetics and paleoanthropology, offering a way to harmonize the biblical account with scientific findings about human origins. It's a specific, if speculative, proposal.
Interesting. And what about those difficult Old Testament passages? The moral monster charges God commanding violence. like in the Canaanite conquest.
He stresses these need to be dealt with carefully on a case-by-case basis, requiring deep dives into the historical and literary context.
What's his take on the Canaanite commands, for example?
He argues it was primarily a command for the Canaanite nations to be destroyed as political entities, to be divested of the land, largely due to their pervasive wickedness described in the text. He argues it wasn't necessarily a command for genocide in the sense of killing every single individual. If they had simply left, he suggests, nobody needed to die at all.
Yeah.
He often recommends work by scholars like Paul Copan, who explore these difficult texts in depth.
Okay, so it requires careful contextual reading, not just simplistic interpretations.
Absolutely. Nuance is key for these passages.
All right, let's shift gears one last time. We've covered his argument. What about Craig the debater? He's famous for his public debates. What's his methodology?
He is indeed a formidable debater. A key part is rigorous preparation. Both he and his opponents typically know the topic well in advance and spend a great deal of time preparing your strongest arguments. Often, they even exchange opening statements beforehand.
And his style in the debate itself.
He heavily emphasizes formal logic. He often presents his arguments as precise, numbered syllogisms. He even tells audiences to memorize the premises so they can follow along and see if the opponent actually refutes one of them.
Keeps things focused.
Very focused. It allows him to maintain a tight logical structure, which can be very persuasive in a live setting. He's also incredibly skilled at identifying red herrings points that sound relevant but don't actually engage with the core premises of his argument.
How does he handle those?
Often by asking that simple, direct question, exactly which premise of the argument does the objection challenge? It forces the opponent back to the structure of the argument and prevents the debate from drifting into unrelated territory.
He also seems careful about judging his opponents personally.
Yes, he makes a point of this. He says he's not interested in making personal judgments about whether non-theists are rational or not. His goal isn't to judge people, but to evaluate arguments. He wants to show that atheism is false, not that atheists are irrational. He distinguishes persons are rational, arguments are sound.
That probably helps keep the tone more intellectual and less personal, right?
It aims to, yes, to make it about the ideas, not ad hominem attacks. And he's debated in all sorts of formats, from very structured university debates against figures like Hitchens, Harris, Krauss.
Some big names.
Absolutely. To more free-flowing British parliamentary-style debates like at the Cambridge Union, which he apparently found particularly enjoyable. Even people who strongly disagree with him often concede his skill and persuasion and how logical he can sound.
But he does face criticism for his debating style and methods, doesn't he?
Oh, definitely. There are significant critiques. Some argue that oral debate itself isn't really about finding truth, but is more a form of entertainment. They feel real intellectual progress happens in careful, written scholarship, not in the heat of a timed debate.
What about specific criticisms of his arguments in debates?
Accusations include things like selective scholarship, taking scientific results or philosophical theorems out of context, interpreting things in unorthodox ways to fit his argument, or mischaracterizing results for the sake of a gotcha. Some feel he can be slippery.
Any other common critiques?
There's the charge he sometimes relies on niche scientists and philosophers whose views aren't mainstream, or only cites mainstream figures when they happen to agree with him. Some argue his moral argument has presuppositional elements, that it basically assumes God to prove God.
And Lawrence Krauss had issues with his use of probability.
Yes, Krauss called his use of Bayesian probability disingenuous smoke and mirrors, feeling Craig didn't properly handle the mathematical nuances. There is also a suggestion from some critics that he sometimes makes statements when he's speaking that are much stronger than anything he writes in his books, perhaps because spoken claims aren't subject to the same rigorous fact-checking as published work.
So there's definitely pushback and ongoing debate about his methods.
For sure. It's important to be aware of those criticisms alongside his successes.
But despite the critiques, what's his overall impact and legacy? How significant is his work considered?
Even with the criticisms, his significance is widely acknowledged. He's often credited with having raised the bar of Christian scholarship in our generation. Some call him the finest Christian apologist of the last half-century.
That's high praise.
It is. His work is seen by many as vital in fostering a cultural milieu in which the gospel can be heard as a viable option for thinking people. He's seen as a major player in that titanic intellectual struggle over worldviews happening in Western culture.
And does his work impact people personally?
Sources suggest it does,
Right.
profoundly. There are anecdotes about non-Christians with genuine intellectual questions who felt dismissed or shut down elsewhere, but found Craig's rigorous, respectful engagement helpful. It gave them that intellectual permission to believe we talked about earlier, showing that faith and reason can coexist.
And those big debates, even if criticized, have reached a huge audience, right?
Absolutely. His debates with Hitchens, Harris, Krauss, and others are viewed millions of times online. They've undeniably brought complex, philosophical, and scientific arguments about God's existence into the public square, making them accessible, or at least visible, to a much broader audience.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Craig's journey, his core arguments, column, fine-tuning, moral, resurrection, his debating style, and his impact.
We really have navigated that complex landscape from the very beginning of the universe to the basis for right and wrong to the historical claims about Jesus. You can really see how he meticulously constructs this comprehensive intellectual case for theism.
And the goal isn't forced belief, but reasoned persuasion.
Exactly, offering that intellectual permission to believe for people grappling with these huge questions.
All right, let's wrap up. As a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over, consider this. Craig argues that a universe without moral accountability and devoid of value is unimaginably terrible. And as he points out, practically no one atheist, agnostic, or otherwise can actually live consistently with that view. We all instinctively praise selflessness, condemn cruelty, live as if values are real and life has meaning.
Right. That deep-seated intuition.
So the question to leave you with is, what does this almost universal human experience of morality, value, and purpose tell you about the ultimate nature of reality? What might it suggest about what it truly means to live a consistent and meaningful life?
It's definitely a question worth continuing to explore long after this deep dive ends.